thank you all for coming today. Allow me to introduce myself. My name's Elizabeth Coffer-Bush, and I'm the co-director of the Center for American Studies here at Christopher Newport University. And we're so thrilled to have you here to celebrate Constitution Day a week and 2 days late, but still worth celebrating. Constitution Day commemorates the signing of the U.S. Constitution. Now, I also feel obligated to tell you all that in just a little over 2 years, we're going to be celebrating the semi-quincentennial, which is the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. That's not commemorated by when the Constitution was signed, but by when the Declaration of Independence was signed. So that's coming up, and it's going to be a nationwide celebration, so keep that on your calendar, July 4th, 2026. A little bit about the Center for American Studies. We were founded because we believe in the importance of civic education. We were inspired by an organization called the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles in History. They help support academics like myself and the two esteemed gentlemen to my right. They support programs like this, and so we want to thank them very much. We also support the curriculum in American Studies and National Security here. I also want to give a shout out. If you see folks in blue blazers and blue polo shirts, actually maybe stand up so I could recognize you. These are our student fellows. Most of them are in the hallway at the moment they were signing you in. We couldn't do this without them. They're fantastic. And if you have any questions or are interested in a position such as theirs, you can talk to any of them or me at the end of the program. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. They're going to speak on Tocqueville and the Constitution and take some various turns off that path. But as you know, one of the most important books written about America is Democracy in America, and probably almost all of you in the audience have to read portions of that this semester. So they're going to give you a little sneak preview. First, and this may not be the order in which they speak, I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel Cullen, Professor of Philosophy at Rhodes College, which is one of our aspirant peer organizations, where he directs the Project for the Study of Liberal Democracy. He is a senior fellow for constitutional studies at the Jack Miller Center, and he serves as on the center's academic council. He is a board member of the Association for Core Text Studies and Courses, an international organization devoted to the advancement of liberal education, and he recently served on the Bipartisan Policy Center's task force on restoring campus culture of free expression. Joseph Knippenberg is a professor of politics at Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, Georgia. He actually gave me one of my very first teaching positions, so he's responsible for some of you having to listen to me today. He received his BA from James Madison College of Michigan State and received an MA and PhD from the University of Toronto. Some of your professors also have. His research and teaching interests focus on contemporary liberal theory and the history of political philosophy, religion, and politics. Both are public intellectuals, publishing in various academic and non-academic publications. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over. We're going to have each of them give a talk, and then we're going to open up for Q&A. So please join me in welcoming our two guests.
So you're still wondering who's who. I'm Dan Cullen. I didn't know that Rhodes was a place that CNU aspires to be like. I've never met anybody who wanted to be me before. I have to say, when Professor KB, and I'm told that's how you refer to her, first broached the topic of Tocqueville and the Constitution, I stupidly said, yeah, sure, no problem. Well, it is a problem, and not just because both topics are a reach for me, although they're definitely not for my good friend Joe Knippenberg, so all is going to be well. But it's a problem Because while Tocqueville refers to the Constitution in Democracy in America, he also downplays its importance. Shockingly to us, I think, he doesn't mention the Declaration of Independence, which summarizes the political philosophy of Lockean liberalism on which the Constitution is based, we think. And he ends up saying that what preserves the stability of American democracy is not so much its laws, of which the Constitution is the apex, but what we would call its political culture, something more sociological, we might say. So when I realized that this was going to be a really problematic topic for me, and I dithered for as long as I could, I landed on a subtitle, Tocqueville and the Constitution, Saving Democracy from Itself. I know the subtitle is odd. It's provocative, maybe even a little offensive, and paradoxical. But I think it's the key to combining the perspectives of Tocqueville and the Constitution. What's odd is suggesting that democracy might need to be saved from democracy. It's possibly offensive to any Democrats, anyway, because there's a long-standing and influential critique of the Constitution as being itself undemocratic. You've heard it said, I'm sure, and if you've studied political science at all, I think you have, that the Constitution, if anything, needs to be saved, democracy needs to be saved from a Constitution that unreasonably limits it and reduces its sway. That was certainly the default setting of American political science when I was an undergraduate in Montreal. As for Tocqueville, wasn't he the one who famously said democracy is a providential fact, that it's the future from which there's no turning back? So why would preserving democracy be a problem? When I say he downplays the significance of the Constitution, I have in mind his portrayal of democracy first as a social condition of equality. And he later tells us that the American Constitution isn't even the best form of government a democratic people per se could adopt. And by the way, in that, he agrees with the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said that no country today would or should adopt the Constitution that we did. So near the end of Volume 1 of Democracy in America, some of you are going to get there soon, when Tocqueville turns to the things that can preserve a democratic republic, he doesn't stress fidelity to the Constitution, which is what the Jack Miller Center would like him to say, but he emphasizes instead the preservation of something he calls mœurs. A French word you might be familiar with, the Latin version of mores, which means habits, opinions, beliefs, customs. Tocqueville seems to be appealing to a classical and ancient notion of a regime. The Greek word is politeia, and it turns out that that's the actual title of Plato's Republic, which some of you have read. And a regime is an organization of life that gives social life a form. It stamps a people with a distinctive character. You might say it makes a society recognizably a people. But that ancient idea of constitutionalism was abandoned by the framers of the American Republic, for whom religious and political soul-shaping efforts were illegitimate intrusions on our individuality, or we might say on our private life. All of this is to say it's difficult to keep Tocqueville and the Constitution in the same picture frame. But I think the way to do it, and this is by no means original to me, in fact, nothing I say this afternoon is original to me. The way to do it is to think about what it means for a democratic people to be a constitutional people. And I'll say something first about how Tocqueville understands the Americans as a democratic people, and then consider whether and how they can be a constitutional people as James Madison and the Federalists at least intended. So let me go back to the issue of democracy as a regime, meaning, again, the authoritative imposition of a way of life, an ethos that is backed by political rule. An example, some of you have read Thucydides, perhaps. Pericles bragged about the way the Athenians, in the funeral oration, bragged about the way the Athenians were superior to the Spartans. John McCain once said Russia was a gas station masquerading as a country. Well, Pericles' point was Sparta was a CrossFit gym masquerading like a polis. They trained for war. Taking the concept of regime seriously means recognizing that there are better and worse ways of living, and that suggests that we ultimately need to know what human excellence or human virtue is, because if we don't know that, how are we to live? In other words, that question seems to point to philosophy. Well, Tocqueville compares and contrasts two modes of living, two ways of being, which he calls aristocratic man and democratic man. And that reminds us of the orientation that we find in Plato and Aristotle toward the question of what is the best regime that human beings could live under. But again, for we moderns, that's outrageous. A constitution is not intended to reflect or impose a regime. It's a limit on government's power. It's a limit on the possibility of rulers imposing a way of life on the ruled. But what happens when the people rule? Tocqueville tells us that the fundamental feature of democratic life is equality. And that equality generates the idea of the sovereignty of the people. And that proposition, the sovereignty of the people, is something new in human affairs that arguably just puts to an end this interesting question of what regime, what political organization would most contribute to human flourishing. The new egalitarian social state that Tocqueville saw aborning in America resembles that fictional device of modern political philosophy, the state of nature, insofar as it generates the sense and the opinion that our default setting is not obedience, but freedom. Each individual naturally obeys only himself or herself, and political life must reflect that inherent sovereignty over oneself. That's a phrase that John Stuart Mill would later use, and I think Joe may have something to say about that later. Political life now requires that individuals see themselves as represented in any will of the people as a whole, in any kind of larger unity, in any kind of first-person plural. But this means that democracy is predicated on the most asocial foundation imaginable, the state of nature, before government, before politics, when human beings have no connection to one another but are radically free. The question arises, how then will we be capable of living some way of life? How are we going to be attached to something in common? And this brings us to the famous problem of individualism that Tocqueville described as a condition of depoliticization and dissociation, radical separateness. It's been captured powerfully by the French political philosopher Pierre Manent, who writes this, I'm quoting, "If democratic men are citizens, they can only be free citizens because civic life presupposes the abandonment of this independence that has totally gained their favor. Consequently, they are not willingly free citizens. The democratic dogma, which is the idea of the sovereignty of the people, thus engenders indifference to public things. This dogma postulates that independence is the natural state of man, that the humanity of man is entirely contained in each individual. The humanity of man is, in right, if not in fact, separable from the body politic in which he lives. What the tradition of thought, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, and then forward to Edmund Burke, let's say, what the tradition of thought regarded as the result of some rigorous exercise of civic and moral virtues, namely, to be able to live free. Democracy holds as a minimum threshold requirement. We just presume it. It's not an achievement so much as our starting point. That's Menant. Independence, finally, he says, must therefore find a place in every human relation between men and women, father and child, even between man and God. Independence, the absence of attachment, you might say, has to somehow be present, a feature of all these deep human relations. Do you see how paradoxical that is? Democracy has attachment issues. So do I. So do you. There's a moment in democracy in America where Tocqueville grapples directly with this kind of unraveling of society. And he refers to the waning of what he calls instinctive patriotism, which ensues, he says, Tocqueville, when people see their country only by a weak and doubtful light. So, he writes, they see their country nowhere, and they retreat into a narrow and unenlightened egoism. The remedy is not to try and re-inspire some kind of visceral patriotism. That, Tocqueville says, has fled, and it's not coming back. What he does say is that we might get people to see that somehow their individual interest, which they are locked on like with radar, that their individual interest might be linked to the interest of the country. And instead of a narrow and unenlightened egoism, we might encourage a broader and enlightened perception of what he calls self-interest well understood, self-interest bien entendu. It's like a perceptual thing about self-interest. You can mistake it, which is strange because obviously it's so close to you. A connection he's looking for between one's individual betterment and the prosperity of the whole. And Tocqueville thinks men this way can be interested in the fate of their country by getting them to participate somehow in their government. How? He says the civic spirit is inseparable in the future from the exercise of rights. That's the path to reanimating some kind of patriotic concern that is not, however, going to have the emotional intensity of what certainly ancient patriotism was about. I think this is a problem. I can't go into it now, but I'll just sort of forecast it, that most of us today, when we think of taking our rights seriously, are aware of the critique that that just makes us more insular, that that's going to make us less concerned with the rest of society and again, intensely concerned with our own interests. So there's an interesting idea there that needs some elaboration, why Tocqueville would point to that as a way to reconnect a sense of social solidarity. Okay. I heard from Professor KB that some of you are reading at least the chapter on Tocqueville's tyranny of the majority, or what we might today call populism, so let me say a few words about that. Tocqueville acknowledges that this dogma of popular sovereignty means, and I'm quoting him, above all the institutions and beyond all the forms, there's a sovereign power, that of the people, which can abolish or change them as it pleases. And now we face a conundrum. There's no legitimate authority in social life higher than the people themselves. But if the people acknowledge no limits to their own will, they'll fare badly, Tocqueville thinks, and the social bond will unravel. And this dilemma, I think, that the people are the highest authority, but when they're conscious of themselves as being the highest authority, then society, the social bond, and patriotic attachment is at risk. This dilemma, or paradox, is at the heart not only of Tocqueville's democracy, but I think the American Constitution. So let me turn to that. The best interpreter of Tocqueville in the Constitution I know, Harvey Mansfield of Harvard University, from whom everything that follows is borrowed, even stolen. Mansfield has pointed out that the conservative and liberal partisans today often regard the Constitution only as a means of getting what they want. Both sides, he says, view the Constitution as an instrument of the people, not as a control on them. The Constitution is regarded with a spirit of utilitarianism, even opportunism, as if the Constitution didn't have some kind of character or spirit of its own, by which maybe we might live better if we attended to it. In the eyes of partisans, the Constitution is to be used, not lived under. The Constitution, in other words, is, we think, below the people, not above them. And while Americans still occasionally invoke divine guidance and thus acknowledge, even in some uneasy way, divine authority over our lives, we've forgotten, Mansfield says, why we need a human authority over the people, even over the people. The people have some deficits. But the truth is, the Constitution is not our fundamental law. It's only the most fundamental law we have. Do you see the thrust of that? It's not our fundamental law that we bow down to. It's only the most fundamental law we have. It's an interesting thought. More fundamental than the Constitution, this is Mansfield again, is the agreement to have a limited Constitution rather than a fundamental law, a Constitution limited to securing individual rights rather than prescribing their exercise in some favored way of life. In other words, one might say in Tocqueville's words, what's more fundamental than the Constitution remains the principle of popular sovereignty, which Tocqueville calls the law of laws and the generative principle of the American people. So although we might conclude that it would be healthy for the people to regard themselves as living under a constitution, it would maybe keep their self-interest in some check, encourage patriotism. The truth of popular sovereignty is the people are above it, and they know it. How then can the sovereign people who are higher than the laws look up with reverence upon their own creation? That was a question James Madison tried to grapple with in Federalist 49. Thanks to Thomas Jefferson's brilliant idea that when there are major conflicts about what the Constitution means, let's just have another constitutional convention like Philadelphia and let the people sort it out. Madison's jaw dropped. The problem of reverence. Constitutional government is a limited government, not only in the sense that people set limits to the scope of political power, whether it can intrude on your religious belief or your gun ownership or something like that, but also because in establishing it, the people sets limits on itself. This act of self-limitation is like a chemical change, or brings it about, in which the sovereign people posited by modern political philosophy transforms itself, so to speak, into a constitutional people, imposing on itself a discipline justified by the principles of natural right, not divine right. They're not doing it out of obedience to God. Self-imposed. The transformation of a sovereign into a constitutional people also involves an exchange of natural rights into civil rights, and the voluntary submission of the people to the Constitution that will now secure them. So, the people is indeed the highest authority, but a constitutional people is the highest authority under the Constitution. In this view, the wisdom of the people is manifested not by subordinating government to their direct opinion, but rather by their self-restraint in respecting a certain distance between themselves and their institutions. Madison says in the Federalist, Publius says in the Federalist, that the distinguishing feature of the new government of the United States is the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity, people as a whole, from any role in it. That's amazing. Where are the people? Right. This posture of reverence that follows on this logic protects the people against their own tendency to bring their partial interests into the political arena and try to turn them into matters of fundamental constitutional concern. So back to the argument of Federalist 49, the rule of reason would be compromised by Jefferson's idea of periodic appeals to the people on fundamental questions, because the people just won't transcend their all too human tendency to factionalism. An attitude of reverence then is needed, a prejudice against frequent change of the Constitution. That's what Jefferson was all for that. A prejudice against that was crucial. The people would have a kind of salutary distance from their own power, allowing their representatives the freedom to act on their behalf, but not immediately at their direct behest. So, in sum, constitutionalism demands a people that's independent, but not so much as to think itself capable of governing without a constitution. American constitutionalism, or the dilemma of American constitutionalism, is that the Constitution can't actually serve the people well when they see it as merely their instrument. That's where the reverence comes in. Paradoxically, reverence for the Constitution is expressed in the choice of a constitutional people to limit their own choice, their own power to choose, their freedom to choose. A constitutional people, and again this is Mansfield's emphasis, is mindful of its sovereignty, but also of its own political incapacity. The people just would not be good at governing. And Tocqueville himself emphasized that first point of the people's sovereignty. And he worried about the second one, their incapacity, because he thought that the dogma of popular sovereignty tends to make people think that they're omnicompetent, and not just in politics, but when it comes to understanding morality and everything else important in life. Federalists like Madison risked the reputation of being called bad Democrats in order to produce better Democrats. They wanted what might be called a reflective republicanism that's alive to the dangers that come from within the Republican principle of the sovereignty of the people, and therefore accepts some non-democratic or non-Republican devices to both animate it, energize it, but also to preserve it and make it stable. So I'll conclude now by returning to that original point I made about how Tocqueville downplays the Constitution by recalling this remark from Democracy in America, which I think is especially impressive in this light. Here's what Tocqueville wrote. What is new in the history of societies, never seen this before, is to see a great people warned by its lawgivers that the wheels of government are stopping, turn its attention on itself without haste or fear, sound the depth of the illness, and then wait for 2 years to find the remedy at leisure, and then finally, when that remedy has been indicated, submit to it voluntarily, without it costing humanity a single tear or drop of blood. That wasn't the way the French Revolution turned out, which was very much in Tocqueville's mind. So democracy perhaps can be saved and needs to be saved from itself, but it needs a constitution more than it needs ever more democracy, ever increasing democratization. I think Tocqueville and Madison agree on that. Now I'll turn it over to Joe to make some sense out of all of this. Thank you.
As always, Dan Cullen is a very tough act to follow. Thank you, Dan, for very illuminating remarks. Thank you also, Professor, as he put it, KB. I am on my third visit to Christopher Newport, thanks to Professor KB. She is, well, I have my two favorite academic hosts here today. Professor KB is one, Professor DC is the other. I've been to Rhodes a number of times as well. If you had to ask me what my topic is, Professor Cullen stayed kind of close to the topic, talking about Tocqueville and the Constitution. I'm going to talk about Tocqueville and the unwritten Constitution, so to speak, focusing on the role of elites in democracy. The Constitution itself never explicitly mentions either elites or democracy, but it perhaps in some ways implies both. So without further ado, my talk, the title I gave it before I came here was Elites and Our Democracy. In recent years, we've heard a lot of talk about defending against assaults on our democracy. The pedantic teacher of American government in me wants to respond testily. It's our democratic republic, not our democracy. And that's the terminology preferred by the great Martin Diamond, the teacher of my teachers at James Madison College, not the university in Harrisonburg, but the college that's a part of Michigan State University. And the great James Madison himself insisted that the United States was to be a republic, not a democracy. In Federalist 10, he said, one of the great points of difference between a democracy and a republic is the delegation of the government in the latter, that is to say, in the republic, to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. What's more, while the Constitution explicitly states in Article 4 that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, it doesn't say anywhere that the United States shall guarantee to anyone democracy. Of course, my pedantry to the contrary notwithstanding, we always talk about our democracy. Tocqueville talked about democracy. But I want to focus our attention on that small number of citizens that Madison regarded as crucial to our republic. His opponents at the time, the Anti-Federalists, worried that the small number would consist almost exclusively, as they put it, of men of the most elevated rank in life. You know, a few years ago we would have referred to them as the 1%. Moreover, writing to John Adams in 1813, Thomas Jefferson asserts that that form of government is best which provides the most effectually for a pure selection of these natural aristoi, naturally best people, natural aristocrats, into the offices of government, and insists that we should leave to the citizens the free election and separation of the aristoi from the pseudo-aristoi, of the wheat from the chaff. In general, they will elect the real good and wise. So, Jefferson, the partisan of constant conventions and revolutions and so on, also was a partisan apparently of a kind of natural as opposed to artificial aristocracy. So let me state the issue that I'm going to address, or at least pose to you in this way. Do we citizens of a democratic republic elect a small number of natural aristoi, or do we elect pseudo-aristoi to govern our country? One of the ways that I'm going to talk about it, and this was in the title of my talk, is to refer to elites. Political scientists use that word. And they think sometimes that where the real power and influence in what we call loosely and somewhat incorrectly democracy is actually in the hands of these elites, constituted by wealth, by education, or by cultural prominence. Now, when I was a young student of political science more than 40 years ago, the notion of elites was associated with three Italian scholars, Vilfredo Pareto, Gaetano Mosca, and Robert Michels. In a way, it's fitting that our focus on elites, at least the political science focus on elites, came from Italy, the home also of Niccolo Machiavelli, who in the Prince distinguishes between what he calls the nobles and the people. The people, he says, want to be left alone so that they can securely conduct their private lives. The nobles are distinguished from the people above all by their ambition, which means that at the very least, they'll have to bother the people from time to time. The people are the matter with which the nobles build their state, their position. In The Prince, he addresses himself, that is to say, Machiavelli addresses himself to one noble in particular, and perhaps to other smart nobles in general, offering what he knows so that they can pursue their goal intelligently and effectively. He would have those nobles recognize that their true adversaries are not the people, but other nobles, and tells them how they can win that competition. What I want to take away from Machiavelli for the moment is the recognition that ambition is a natural fact of life, and that in his terms, nobles will always be around. In the familiar language of Federalist 51, ambition will always counteract ambition. Now I'm going to step, and this is a very bold step, into Machiavelli's shoes, and draw a contrast between two kinds of elites in our democracy. My templates for this contrast, and okay, I'm finally getting to Tocqueville. So Alexis de Tocqueville as a template for one kind of elite, and his contemporary and sometime friend, John Stuart Mill, as a template for the other kind of elite. I'm going to paint with very broad brushstrokes, but what I'm going to suggest is they offer different ways in which people who are in some way elite can think about their roles in a democracy, think about those democratic tendencies and impulses they should seek to promote and those they should seek to discourage, about what institutions they should foster, that should foster the facilitating the flourishing of what's best and counteracting what's worst. In this discussion, I want to focus on three areas in which the Tocqueville-Mill juxtaposition is illuminating and instructive for those who might be members of our elite. These are local government, religion, and higher education. I'll take these up in turn, but I want to begin by noting that all these institutions are, in a sense, extra-constitutional. They're not prescribed or described in our Constitution. The Constitution doesn't prescribe the manner in which we govern ourselves locally. The Constitution, so far as it talks about religion, basically abstains from having anything to say about it. It guarantees religious liberty, it prohibits a certain kind of establishment, and it prohibits religious tests for office holding. And it says nothing about how we should organize our system of higher education. That is not to say that the people who wrote the Constitution didn't have opinions about all these things. But they didn't write them into our national constitution. So let me begin with local government. If you've started reading Tocqueville, you may have come across this passage early in Volume 1, where Tocqueville celebrates the New England township. He says, "It is in the township that the force of free peoples resides. The institutions of a township are to freedom what primary schools are to science. They put it within the reach of the people, they make them taste its peaceful employ, and habituate them to making use of it. Without the institutions of a township, a nation can give itself free government, but it does not have the spirit of freedom." So if we're all about liberty and freedom, we should, Tocqueville seems to suggest, be all about local self-government. The township, he says, combines independence and power, which is what makes it interesting to us and engaging to those who live in it. Township citizens understand that they have the authority and wherewithal to address problems and issues that are within the compass of their experience and imagination. It's government that you can feel and touch and be involved in. I run into my local government officials in the oddest places. It is there that they begin an engagement, that is to say, we, the people, begin an engagement with public life that can carry and be extended to more distant state and national concerns. Thus, Tocqueville says that by charging citizens with the administration of small affairs, much more than by leaving the government of great ones to them, one interests them in the public good and makes them see the need they constantly have for one another in order to produce it. To be sure, he concedes that the result of this local civic engagement will not satisfy those who are fastidious about excellence and regularity in government. A government controlled by certified experts would produce a more polished and regular result. But human initiative, human freedom, in some respects for Tocqueville, humanity itself, would be lost or threatened thereby. Now, John Stuart Mill, as I said, was a sometime friend and contemporary of Tocqueville. He wrote roughly 90 pages worth of reviews of volumes 1 and 2 of Democracy in America, and they're very interesting in a lot of ways. In his review of volume 1, he seems largely to agree with Tocqueville on local government. He says, this is John Stuart Mill, is a fundamental principle in his political philosophy, that is to say, in Tocqueville's political philosophy, as it has long been in ours, that only by the habit of superintending their local interests can that diffusion of intelligence and mental activity, as applied to their joint concerns, take place among the mass of the people, which can qualify them to superintend with steadiness or consistency the proceedings of their government, and to exercise any power in national affairs except by fits or as tools in the hands of others. So he sounds like he's simply agreeing with Tocqueville. And I think if you pay attention to his language, you'll see that it's not quite as simple as that. First of all, Tocqueville is all about the use of freedom. Mill is all about the diffusion of intelligence and mental activity. One of the professors who taught in my department at the University of Toronto described John Stuart Mill as a developmental liberal, someone who is all about, perfecting at least some aspect of or some portion of humanity. Mill also uses the language of superintendence. Tocqueville's New England townships involved direct action on the part of the people to address their local problems. Mill's conception of it is electing people. Now, which is what we do now, but Mill's conception is electing people to deal with our problems, not addressing them ourselves. In fact, he says, in England, it would be useless calling upon the people themselves to bestow habitually any larger share of attention on municipal management than is implied in the periodical election of a representative body. I think that's probably what most of us would say about our own roles now. We elect our local officials from time to time, and that's what we do. But Mill goes on to say that in some rural districts, even that's too much to ask. The people there are, as he puts it, so much more backward. So Mill's local government is not the direct engagement of the New England township, but the election of a representative body to do what New Englanders do for themselves. Elections, in the best instance, produce this, according to Mill. Provided good intentions can be secured, the best government must be the government of the wisest, and these must always be a few. The people ought to be their masters, but they are masters who must employ servants more skillful than themselves. This sounds again sort of like Jefferson's natural aristoi. It's an elite. We elect an elite who are wiser, Mill hopes, than we are. Where Tocqueville is willing to accept variation, unevenness, and even sometimes ineptitude for the sake of maintaining human freedom, Mill seems more concerned with what might be called professional excellence or technical proficiency. This doesn't mean he's willing to countenance the manipulation of the people by their intellectual betters, but he seems willing to sacrifice initiative and freedom for the sake of better legislative and policy outcomes. It's also plausible to argue that Mill regards one of the roles of this elite is as tutelary, as developmental, as they're supposed to be agents in the enlightenment of the rest of us. Now, I don't think this means that he's looking forward to a time in the future when we all raise ourselves to the level of the elite. But he is, in his approach to governance at the local level and governance across the board, more interested in, or less interested in protecting rights, say, to life, liberty, and property, and more interested in promoting what he calls in his famous On Liberty, the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. Mill's commitment here to the permanent interests of man as a progressive being goes a long way to explaining his difference with Tocqueville on the place of religion in a democracy, my next topic. The Frenchman is famous for asserting in Volume 1 that religion is the first of American political institutions because it singularly facilitates our use of freedom. It teaches Americans, he says, the art of being free. Indeed, in Volume 2, he goes so far as to say that I doubt that man can ever support a complete religious independence and an entire political freedom at once. And I am brought to think, and let me emphasize this, that if he has no faith, he must serve. And if he is free, he must believe. Religion and liberty are inextricably connected for Tocqueville. I could spend a lot of time explaining why Tocqueville holds this very striking view. If you have questions about it, I'm happy to answer them. I will quote only one passage from Volume 1 that makes part of his argument. As a result of religion, Tocqueville says, everything is certain and fixed in the moral world, although the political world seems to be abandoned to the discussion and attempts of men. So the human spirit never perceives an unlimited field before itself. However bold it may be, from time to time it feels that it ought to halt before insurmountable barriers. Something like the belief in human dignity, which has religious roots, is an insurmountable barrier to our imaginations. I face the fact that I cannot simply use my fellow human beings as instruments for whatever I want to use them for. While our political lives may stress freedom and rights, our religious and moral lives focus on duties, responsibilities, and limits. For Tocqueville, this was essential. So, again, a lot more to say about this, but in the interest of time, I'll spare you that. Now, given the extended discussions of the importance of religion in democracy in America, it is remarkable that in his 2 reviews of the book, totaling 90 pages in his collected works, Mill barely mentions religion at all. Now, there are, I think, a number of explanations for this, beginning with the fact that Mill says in his autobiography that, and he's very frank about this, I was brought up from the first without any religious belief in the ordinary acceptation of the term. He has no view, he was raised with no view of, let's call it a creator God who governs the universe by his providence. Mill believes that nature is a confusing mess that has to be molded and mastered so as to be hospitable to human beings. In his view, then, religions that talk about God's creation typically regard people like him who want to mold and master nature with suspicion. They're defying God's will. We want no part of that. So religion is the enemy in some way for Mill. Religion is an obstacle to the interests of man as a progressive being. Now, one can hold some version of Mill's view of nature and of, quote-unquote, the gods without necessarily being utterly hostile and publicly hostile to religion. Tocqueville himself says as much. Sometimes, as Tocqueville puts it, a religious belief is undermined silently by doctrines, such as Mill's, that I shall call negative. But it is even possible then that the unbeliever, Tocqueville says, continues to judge religion useful. Considering religious beliefs under a human aspect, he recognizes their empire over mores, their influence on laws. An atheist or non-theist might regard religion as socially useful, even if not true. Now, Mill is surely aware of such a view, but he rejects it. For him, religion deludes and persecutes, obstructing the mechanisms that make human progress possible. The church, he says, has become a grand instrument for discouraging all culture inconsistent with blind obedience to established maxims and constituted authorities. You hear lines like this to this day applied to religious believers in this country and elsewhere. Human beings should live in the light of the truth, and the truth is not, Mill believes, theistic. What's more, the path to truth proceeds by way of reason and argument and science, not by way of inerrant scripture, sermons, and catechisms. Mill doesn't deny that in the past, moral education might have relied to some degree on religion, but there is nothing about religion that adds to or improves upon the human mechanisms that made use of that religion. Whatever might have been necessary in the infancy of humanity, it's no longer necessary today. We can rely on reason and argument. We don't need to rely on religion. Now, again, I could spend a lot of time exploring, and in my paper, I do spend a lot of time exploring the difference between the two. I'm just going to mention one thing that for Tocqueville is, let's say, an anthropological fact with religious consequences. He says, the short space of 60 years will never confine the whole imagination of man. The incomplete joys of this world will never suffice for his heart. Alone among all the beings, man shows a natural disgust for existence and an immense desire to exist. He scorns life and fears nothingness. These different instincts constantly drive his soul toward contemplation of another world, and it is religion that guides it there. Religion is therefore only a particular form of hope, and it is as natural to the human heart as hope itself. Again, that for Tocqueville is a key to understanding humanity. Mill's having none of it. He could not have written these sentences. So, we have a difference about local government. We have a difference about the role of religion in America or, in fact, anywhere. You don't have to take American religion seriously to understand America, according to Mill. What Mill would put in place of any form of religion isn't the promotion and exaltation of an ideal humanity. It's what we now sometimes call secular humanism. Mill is, you might say, a great proponent of what we would call secular humanism. And this leads me now to my third point of contrast, which has to do with higher education. I'll try to be relatively brief. One can construct from Tocqueville's scattered observations in Democracy in America a relatively coherent account of the place of college education in America. He acknowledges that for most people, it will amount to a form of vocational training. Most Americans, he says, study a science as one takes up a trade, and one takes from it only the applications whose present utility is recognized. But because the human mind naturally rises toward the infinite, immaterial, and beautiful, there is or ought to be a place for what might be called the higher study or contemplation, for those who have gained the leisure to enjoy it. But because there is nothing less fit for meditation than the interior of a democratic society, a proverbial safe space for this contemplation must be found. We must, Tocqueville says, detain the human mind in theory. Practical concerns will take care of themselves. Theory, contemplation of the good, the true, and the beautiful have to be given some assistance, because even though we naturally long for it, there's nothing about our social setting under ordinary circumstances that supports it. This is, as I said, the foundation for the case for the traditional American liberal arts college, and perhaps even for a liberal arts foundation for a more practical or vocationally oriented college or university. What Tocqueville would add, given what he understands about the relationship between the longings of the human mind or the human soul and religion, is that religious or theological considerations should be close to the center of any such curriculum. You can't talk about the good, the true, and the beautiful without talking about God. Religious questions are not artificial or alien to human consciousness, but rather very close to the center of who we are or can be. Now, for Mill, this is obviously not going to be the case. He is, if anything, an even more intransigent advocate for a purely liberal education than is Tocqueville. But he would also, as he puts it, unsectarianize wholly the elite colleges and universities. He says, the very cornerstone of an education intended to form great minds must be the recognition of the principle that the object is to call forth the greatest possible quantity of intellectual power and to inspire the intensest love of truth. And this without a particle of regard to the results to which the exercise of that power may lead. Forming great minds requires, as he says, and he goes on and kind of lists his curriculum, ancient literature, history, logic and philosophy of mind, the philosophy of morals, of government, of law, of political economy, of poetry and art. These should form the subjects of systematic instruction under the most eminent professors who could be found. These being chosen not for the particular doctrines they might happen to profess, except if they happen to profess religious doctrines, in which case they're excluded, but as being those who would be most likely to send forth pupils qualified in point of disposition and attainments to choose doctrines for themselves. It almost goes without saying that this constitutes an elite education, Oxford and Cambridge, not Newcastle, Leeds, or Manchester. And in deference to all of us, I don't mention any American universities in which categories they might fall. I'll say I don't teach at Oxford or Cambridge. My college is supposed to look like a college at Oxford, but the semblance is just on the surface. If this were not already clear, it becomes so in the last sentence of a very interesting essay he wrote after having read Volume 1, but before having encountered Volume 2 of Democracy in America, called Civilization. The main thing which social changes can do for the improvement of, and here's my emphasis, the higher classes, is gradually to put an end to every kind of unearned distinction and to let the only road open to honor and ascendancy be that of personal qualities. Mill has no use for aristocracy, but he embraces and promotes and espouses what we now call meritocracy. Those who excel in the curriculum he's described ought to be the people at the top. They ought to be the ones who are the wisest, wiser than their so-called masters, the people, and educators of their so-called masters, the people. They will lead and elevate the tone of what Mill regards as a commercial civilization characterized above all by the technical proficiency, specialization, and the pursuit of wealth. In our terms, those pursuing the American dream will be educated and governed by this meritocratic elite. They will comprise, as is stated in an essay Mill cites favorably at the end of his review of Volume 2 of Democracy in America, the administration whose purpose is to introduce more and more into the mass the public elements of order and forethought. This is an elite distinguished by its educational accomplishment, that is, by its academic merit from the general public. It is a product of a rigorous education which systematically excludes or marginalizes the kind of religious thinking and sensibility that was in the 19th century, and to some degree still is, characteristic of what Mill calls the public. The question is how the gap between this highly educated elite and the public will be bridged and managed. Tocqueville's fear, already articulated in a letter from America that he wrote in 1831. That 26-year-old Tocqueville says things about American religion that just boggle the mind in their profundity. It's a genius. Mill's a genius too, two different geniuses. And he suggests that without a compelling alternative, which elite intellectualism is not, people will sink into a kind of materialism which paves the way for what he calls at the end of Democracy in America, the kind of despotism democracies have to fear. Many of the features of the education Mill favors, Tocqueville would also support. He might also even assent to the reasons Mill offers for embracing them, but he would not abandon, as Mill emphatically does, what one scholar has called the sacred canopy. Our longing for the infinite and our dissatisfaction with the finite limits of this world are deep-seated and genuine. They cannot be satisfied by making an idol out of idealized humanity, as Mill seems to suggest. So there you have it, a contrast between two elites. A Tocquevillian elite that shares with everyone a common human longing, and that common human longing is in some way the basis for their mutual respect, and thereby recognizes that bolstering the humanity of all of us is a messy, irregular business. That's Tocqueville. And the Millian elite that looks forward to the governance of technocratic experts, who are certainly willing to co-opt others into their ranks, but who have no patience for the irregular desires and infinite longings of ordinary people, or more precisely, of all of us. everyone will be improved to the extent of their capacity at the expense, Tocqueville might fear, of their genuine and common humanity. Now, I've probably overdrawn the contrast a little bit just for the sake of a kind of clarity. And I don't want to insist that we should think of our educational institutions only in this light. They certainly, almost all, lack the rigorous focus that Mill calls for, which I think is probably in some respects a good thing. Or more precisely, their genuine rigor resides mostly in their most technocratic elements, the so-called STEM disciplines, which do a remarkable job of inculcating a kind of scientific professionalism in their students. What even the best of them typically lack, from Mill's point of view, is the broad liberal foundation in classics, philosophy, history, and that whole laundry list of things that I read. This is, I think, for several reasons, a shame. That broad liberal foundation might actually chasten meritocratic pride, inform a nuanced prudential judgment, and teach us a thing or two about the limits of scientific reasoning as applied to human affairs. In a nutshell, contra Mill, it would challenge, or it could challenge, our proud assumptions about our intellectual progress, about human beings as ultimately progressive beings. And humility would go a long way in reconciling elites to and with our democracy. I suspect and hope and believe that you here at CNU are experiencing some of this in the classes you take from my old friends, the Doctors Bush, and some of my newer acquaintances who are their colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for giving us so much to think about. I want to invite those of you who have 4:30 classes to, you can exit at this time or stay a little later, but we're going to open a question and answer period for those who have time to stay, and you might move closer to the front if you would like.
Oh, yeah, that's all. Yeah. Yeah, see ya. Sorry.
And while those who are exiting, I want to take the liberty of asking the first question, and it's going to first go to Dr. Cullen on his sort of side note that he didn't touch on very much in using popular sovereignty and populism interchangeably. And so populism is something I'm sure some of our students know a little bit about, but I wanted you to comment on that, on the two being used interchangeably.
I don't have a well-developed understanding of the term, but populism to me connotes one a sense of grievance against elites, a sense of not being respected, not having one's interests valued or represented, and also a sense of entitlement. After all, we're the people. Those who govern us are not the people. And I think the idea of popular sovereignty really does support that notion fundamentally. Populism, I suppose, though, would be the negative condition into which a healthy democracy could lapse.
Interesting. To Dr. Knippenberg, my question for you is, how might Tocqueville make the justification to Mill that even atheists or those without religious faith might find a value in questioning asking some of the religious questions.
I think ultimately
And there is a microphone there if you want to use it. You don't have to, but I think it should automatically turn on.
It's on. It seems to me that one of the questions that Mill dances around and never fully answers is how do you deal with people who don't go to Oxford or Cambridge? And I mean, Mill has a very frank answer for one kind of person, and part of his biography, and it's also true of his father. James Mill, John Stuart's father, and John Stuart were both employees, essentially bureaucrats in the British colonial administration. I mean, they didn't live in India, but they administered Indian affairs from London. And he's very clear that, in On Liberty, for example, he says, my principles of free and frank discussion so that all sides of the issue are canvassed is only true for people in the maturity of their faculties. It's not true for, the human race in its nonage. And so what that basically means, it's, in the simplest sense, it's good for the UK, but not for India. And the question that I would ask him is, what portion of the UK really is India in your view? Certainly the most rural districts. And the question is, how much can you bring them up? And then what is the basis of the relationship between this hyper-intellectual meritocracy and ordinary people? Are they governed rationally, or are they governed by force? And it's an issue with which we still wrestle. I think back to our long experience with COVID. Were we treated as rational adults capable of understanding and making our own decisions, or were we told to submit to authority? And I think Tocqueville's question is, where do you come down, and how do you treat? How do you have, as it were, a bad conscience about treating most of humanity as essentially not capable, ultimately, of governing themselves and not capable of being reasoned with?
I don't want to monopolize the time, so if anyone has a question, please ask.
Thank you both so much for your talks. This question is for Dr. Cullen. You mentioned that, I believe it was Harvey Mansfield who said that the people on the right and on the left both think about using the Constitution to their own ends, but don't have a proper reverence for it. Could you say more about what it would look like to, instead of thinking of the Constitution as having this only for its utility, to have this kind of reverence, and then how would we cultivate that kind of reverence in the United States?
One quick example would be, don't try to pack the Supreme Court with judges you think are going to be well disposed to your policy preferences. Think about the court as an arbiter, but not an arm of your partisan interests. How you I'd say also, and Mansfield would certainly emphasize this, respect the forms of government and understand that the process isn't just an impediment that's hangover from a former, less democratic time, but that actually the forms might embody a kind of wisdom. So another example would be, in an emergency, we actually defer to the president to act and to exercise rather sweeping powers rather than have the people themselves or the branches closest to the people directly involved. Why? Because the impulses of the people, which are a problem familiar from ancient democratic experience, tend not to be well thought out in moments of crisis. As for the reverence, that I think is a real problem. It's hard to imagine how to get it back once it's been lost. And I think from early on, there was a sense that perhaps the Constitution is insufficiently Republican, anti-federalist view, or we would say insufficiently democratic. And that has been a stigma that has attached to it and only grown in force. And what Mansfield offers is, a very profound but difficult philosophical interpretation of the Constitution that is hard to sell when there's already a deep partisan divide over fundamental constitutional issues. So nowhere in my talk did I indicate, I think, any confidence that we could indeed supply that reverence that Madison originally thought it needed. What I'm struck by is that Madison himself, at the beginning, understood that for this to work, people would have to somehow be capable of this extraordinary act of viewing something which they ordain and establish, right? They create, and so they remain above, as if they were not above it.
I could piggyback on that a little bit. I would add the course that Dr. Morrison says he's teaching about music. What's it called again? Music?
Music in American civic culture.
We need a really soaring poetry of constitutionalism. And, I think Lincoln talked about some of this in the Young Men's Lyceum speech, and then referred again to it in the mystic chords of memory stretching from every patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone. We do need, a much more vigorous and robust, I talked about religion, but also civil religion. And, the Jack Miller Center is doing its darndest to provide the materials for that for those who would make use of it. And Constitution Day itself is an effort to build a kind of framework. And in most cases, it's not really taken terribly seriously. I think most institutions that are legally obliged to commemorate the Constitution get away with ignoring it. So it needs more people like Dr. Bush, like Dr. Cullen, like the people in this room, like the Center for American Studies, to equip people to have, to care about that and to remember it when their partisan passions are at their most heated.
It's interesting, we just finished reading Washington's farewell address and Lincoln's Lyceum address, and both of them allude to the need for these extra constitutional supports for that reverence. So I'm hoping some of my students go away with those takeaways. Alas, we're out of time. But I'm sure at dinner tonight we will solve all of the country's reverential problems. And please feel free to stay and ask some one-on-one questions. But thank you for staying and thank you for coming today. And thank you once again to our guests.